The native is sabotaging me.
Tillas.
We can do the key in Spain.
So between the talks, we need a little bit of a change over time, right? Yeah.
That's the, what, 3 years? 3.5 years?
3.5 years.
Okay, so I was October 2011.
That's when I was the writer.
Have you been somewhere else before that?
No,
What kind of job is that? How long does that last? How long does that last? Do something coming up? Assistant professorships
¿Cuánto sería el préstamo?
allow you to stay.
Varía mucho. Bueno, te acuerdo, ¿cuánto es hoy? Hoy es muy.
Usually not even any other university in Austria. I didn't have anything to do with it. I just started, but president.
Proprio se la aquí tenías casa a Barcelona,
And then you can
por aquí como fue, porque creo que fue Barcelona.
Associate professor. So where are you spending? Doing a PhD. Does that you feel that as you step outside of these
no había inversión importante en cosas interesantes.
studentship?
Yeah.
I found them.
You were studying. Yeah. And then so I thought, what job?
Last one was because we lost them in the cafeteria. They went behind the heater, and we spent like 50 minutes trying to get them out with no problem, with any result. So, and then now we found them in the line there.
No sé esto porque estoy estos cambios creo que tiene más sentido como ahora hay una posición
So this is the last session, and we're having Alex Tillas first, and Chris Walker, and we'll be done. And okay, Alex is going to speak about concepts and innateness.
So thank you, and thanks for having me. What I want to do today is follow Eric's lead and try to approach the thing of the issue of the origins of thought by looking at the issue of origins of concepts, because I'm assuming also that concepts play a fundamental role in our cognitive lives. Not to say that we don't have imagistic thinking, but concepts are the building blocks of our thoughts. And before I start, let me give you a brief plan for the talk. I'll say a few things about the traditional debate. Eric's talk was a brilliant introduction to that. And then I will put forth an empiricist view, and I'm really interested, given the background of people in this room, how this will go down. And I will be arguing that we acquire concepts in virtue of an abstraction process. I already see Chris's reactions to that. So hopefully I will show you that, well, I convince you that we can avoid the traditional problems that Locke has been facing. And my tactic is to spend more time doing simple concepts and explain you how we acquire concepts with that pick out entities with obvious physical similarities like tree and dog. And then I will kind of move out in scope in trying to account for a full repertoire and talk about heterogeneously instantiated concepts. Mainly we'll be looking at danger because I think it's an interesting and quirky case, but the similar story could be said about the other concepts on screen or other heterogeneously instantiated concepts. And then I will look into lofty concepts which are notoriously hard for empiricists to account for, given that these guys do not pick out any tangible entities, let alone entities with obvious similarities. And I will be looking at the case of democracy. Okay? So, in the debate about the origins of concepts, there are mainly two strands. On the one hand, you have people arguing that they are graphically put part of our genetic endowment, and I will be saying more about this in a second, but roughly this is the idea, and on the other hand, empiricists will be claiming that we learn them along the way, okay? Now, interestingly, if you really look in the extant literature, that goes back to Plato, I guess. If you really look for a positive account of how we learn concepts, there isn't much there. There is a keyword, a magic word that Philo puts forth, triggering, and of course there are suggestions in the literature about what we have to do, what has to be in the background in order to acquire concepts, but as far as a positive acquisition account is concerned, there isn't such in the literature, at least in my reading of it. And it's fine if you're a nativist to say that, especially if you're a photo, to say that, well, concepts just become, acquisition is brute causal triggering. He says, boom, and then that's it. And it's fine because you're assuming a lot of innate stuff. But this is actually, to my understanding, the most concrete, positive account in the literature about how we learn concepts, how we acquire concepts rather. And the problem really lies with the empiricists, that these guys say that, well, perceptual experience plays a crucial role. Everything that is in the intellect is first in the senses, and so on and so forth, but they don't have an acquisition story. And if you think that concepts derive from experience, and you don't have such an account, a central plank of your empiricism is just missing. And empiricism is having recently revival from people like Fiona Cowie. Many would think that Cowie is a nativist for various reasons. I think she's what she calls an enlightened empiricist, but mainly focusing on the work of Joseph Prince. And he, I think, has created a vital space for empiricists. He has dealt with a lot of problems that empiricists have traditionally been facing, but when it comes to concept acquisition, he hasn't done much. And hopefully I will be convincing you today that this gap in the literature could be filled. Okay? So, given that the very same concepts I will be using are used by different people in different projects in different ways, I'll go through a rather longish list of preliminaries so that make sure that we're all on the same page. I'm committed to a light-hearted representation of this. Just very briefly, we perceive something and we form a representation, and I would be arguing that we store these representations in memory, nothing more than that, just to make sure that this is on the table. I will be distinguishing between two computational levels, nothing too fancy, just the lower stuff, where you get the perceptual system and pattern recognition abilities like, I don't know, edge detection, luminance discontinuities, the motion detection, positioning in the visual field, stuff like that. And the higher computational level, where you have cognition, and this is where the place where concepts reside, okay? Nothing more than that. But this will allow me to have, to know which resources as an empiricist I'm allowed to look into. So I'm a full nativist when it comes to the lower level, so I'm assuming that we have these pattern recognition abilities, that our perceptual system is really replete with this mechanism, but we have no innate concepts, okay? Then I will be following Stephen Lauren's suggestion. He had a talk a few years ago in Bristol, and he said that in order to acquire a concept, in order to have an account of how we learn concepts, it better be that you have a semantics. It will be really helpful to use that. And I'm taking his advice and using a semantics account as a signposting to the idea is that by the end of the process, I will have a mental particular that can exhibit these semantic properties that refers to things in the world. And once I've done that, I'll know that I have the concept. And the specific account that I align myself with today, I'm not committed to this view. I'm pretty sure that you can have a similar story or an analogous story to the one I'm suggesting by looking or having a different semantics account, but you just have to change some of the details I'll be telling you. So according to Prince's reference, our concept C could refer to X's by having two conditions fulfilled. Condition 1, X is nomologically covariant with tokens of C, and this is a very Fodorian element. And condition B, an X was the actual incipient cause of C. We can talk about this more. Jesse is appealing to Dretsky here, but he's adding the actual bit there. But by and large, as soon as I give you a mental particular that exhibits these properties, I will be assuming that I have a concept that refers. But there's also an additional element that I will be having to account for, namely the cognitive role properties that concepts seem to have. And with regards to this last point, I will be looking at endogenous control. Roughly, the idea is that concepts have this characteristic that I can activate in a top-down manner and not just in a bottom-up manner. I can think of New York while in Spain, and so on and so forth. Nothing fancier than that. And I am arguing that language plays a crucial role in this process, and my idea is that, and I'll say a bit more about that as we go along, but the idea is that once you associate a representation of a particular with a representation of a word, then you can activate the former one in a top-down manner. The reason why this is possible is because we have executive control over linguistic utterances or silent speaking to ourselves, and therefore this ability to endogenously activate the or pronounce or utter the word is bestowed upon the perceptual representation. And language plays a crucial role in the case of lofty concepts, exactly because it will allow me to show you how these things fit into covariance, because I have this nomological covariance condition in the semantics account. Also, I'm assuming that there are top-down effects in perception. Pretty sure everybody accepts that, but not in the literature. There's still doubts about this. Photo publishing famously doubt that. And there are also systematic properties of perceptual systems. I'm pretty sure everybody agrees with that. What I have in mind is something like along the lines of what Barcelou is saying, but pretty sure all perceptions, all theories of perception would agree with what I will tell you. And finally, when it comes to the issue of innateness, there are various views, and this is not an exhaustive list, but there are different ways to approach things. Just in my understanding, at least not the definition, but the notion of innateness that I'm using here comes from Richard Samuels, and according to Richard, if something is innate, then it has to be psychologically primitive, and roughly the idea is that something is psychologically primitive if you learn it via a non-rich psychological process. Okay, so I will be telling you the psychologically rich process, and hopefully I will be showing you that concepts are not innate. Okay, so imagine that it is the first time that I am looking at a tree, okay? And assume that this is the trunk, and these are the branches of the tree, and according to Barcelou, we initially form a, a general representation, a representation of the object's general shape, which is rather sketchy. And we formed that, and we store it in a long-term memory, and based on, idiosyncrasies of the perceptual experience, how long the experience is, we focus also on, driven by salience, we focus on the specific aspects of the perceived object, like the branches of the trees. We form representations, and we store them in the same locus, okay? I'm using locus here just roughly by using John Perry's manila five-folder metaphor. The interesting bit is what happens once you perceive a subsequent instance of the same kind, the next tree that you attend to. Given the same perceptual apparatus that we have, we also form a general shape representation. We form it in long-term memory, and at this short-term memory, and at this point, a scanning process starts. Now, given in principle the same scanning process would have occurred during the first experience, but I wouldn't have anything stored in my mind, so this process wouldn't yield any matching representations. But the second time around, there is some matching representations, and this leads to mainly two things. On the one hand, this stored representation drives selective attention to the same parts that I have attended originally, and the reason that this is possible is because representation of the first experience also carry information about part-to-part and part-to-whole relations, information about these relations, and they allow saccadic movements to drive attention to the same parts. The second thing that happens during this, after we have activated a matching representation, is that the currently formed representations are stored in the same locus. And I'm using locus here rather in a broad term. I'm not really think that it is geographically, I'm not talking about cortical geographical proximity, just having stronger positive memory effect between the two, stuff like that. And in the light of subsequent experiences with these instances, you enrich this locus or this folder with representations of trees, okay? So up to this point, what I have in my mind is representations of particular instances of trees. And that's a problem because concepts should be picking out all instances of a given kind, and therefore they should exhibit this kind of generality that representations of particulars do not. And this is the famous Berkeley versus Locke dispute. And in reply to this answer, there are two main takes. On the one hand, you have people like Locke arguing for an abstraction process. On the other hand, you have people like Hume, Berkeley, and Prince arguing that it's actually the functional role of an idea that does the trick. So it's that we use an idea in particular as a proxy to refer to the whole category. I think that the second idea, well, both of them have problems. I think that the best way to go is to stick with Locke, and I will be showing you why that is the case. But this is the other main alternative. And according to Locke, there are two abstraction processes. The one occurs during perception, through sensation, as he calls it. So I can, he uses the example with a piece of chalk, but I can abstract away from all this information in the optical array or in the room and just focus on the wideness of this thing. And this is done by selective attention, really, and this is rather uncontroversial. But the interesting bit and the controversial stuff is when it comes to reflection, where you have to compare and contrast previous experiences or representations formed during previous experiences in order to identify the overlapping similarities. And the obvious way to do that is, well, of course, by having a concept and assuming that all these different instances are instances of that kind, which is, of course, circular because you presuppose what you should be explaining. And here is a way to avoid this problem. So I think that this problem is solved prior to the abstraction process. So I don't think that the abstraction process has to solve this problem. Why? Because we only select, or the abstraction process only selects information in a given locus. And the content of the given locus are influenced by these top-down effects that I mentioned earlier. Now, abstraction process is, another characteristic of this process is that it's neither endogenously controlled. It's not that I'm saying, okay, at this point let me kick in the abstraction in order to get the concept, and it's neither stimulus-driven either. And it's not stimulus-driven either. So it's not that a specific stimulus would trigger this process, so it's nothing like classic Fedorian triggering. Rather, there has to be two thresholds, a quantitative and a qualitative threshold, a certain number of representations, and a suitably diverse range of representations. The first one is easy to get, I guess, just a few experiences. The second one, I'm just appealing here to information stored by a peripheral vision and some non-attended information during the experiences with instances of a given kind. So you get some diversity there, or contextual features and so on and so forth. Now the output of the abstraction process, or this abstract representation, is sensitive to frequencies of occurrences in the input, in the sense that the more frequent a given feature appears in the instances of a given kind, it's like triangle branches for all trees, the higher the probability that these features will appear in my abstract representation. And the question is, how do you do that? How do you actually compute the similarities across instances? Well, I think that there's no need, and that's the point, I guess, that nativists would press me against, push against, is that there's no need to have any independent criterion of sameness. Because if I allow the concept of sameness, because if I allow for that, then I will open the door to innate concepts, and I wouldn't have a criterion of where to draw the line, which concepts are innate and which are learned. And in order to solve this problem of how you pick up the overlapping similarities, I'm appealing to Hebbian associationism, or the Hebbian rule of learning. I'm pretty sure you're all familiar with that. Just very briefly, Hebb was trying to see how the how experience with our environment shapes our brain, and he basically said that, well, if you co-activate two neuronal groups time and time again, at the same time, the connection between them becomes strengthened. The stronger the connection, the higher the probability that activating neuron A would trigger activation of neuron B, okay? Now, project that to this story of representation that I've been telling you so far, and if we assume that all members of a given category bear enough similarities with each other, and assuming that without implying a one-to-one mapping between properties and neuronal groups, but I'm assuming that the same groups would be underlying, grounding perceptual experiences of instances of a given kind. Therefore, the connection between these neurons would become stronger over time. So essentially, you can think also that in terms of conditioning or long-term pronunciation. You're more expert than I am in this field, but long-term pronunciation is, the evidence that I'm finding in the literature is that you can find all over the brain, the spinal cord, and nervous system. So it's rather widely accepted that this thing exists. So basically, what you need from the abstraction process to do is just cherry-pick all the information that are carried by stronger connections. The process doesn't need to know that this representation is similar to the other. Just to know that this representation is, or this piece of information is carried by neurons that are strongly connected to each other. And I think in this way you can avoid the need to have the same as criteria. Okay? Now, as far as up to this point, there are certain similarities to the abstraction model that I'm suggesting here with traditional problems, with traditional models, and therefore you might be thinking that there are also certain problems with this one. But just to clarify that the input of my abstraction process are not simple concepts, as in the Lockean paradigm, and the output is not a concept as well, or either. Namely, what I call here the output of the abstraction process is a product concept, nothing to do with the Fodorian Norton product concept. Roughly, that is a mental particular that exhibits these nomological covariance properties that I wanted, but it's not a concept yet in the sense that it's not triggered or activatable in a top-down manner as concepts are. And I told you already the story that language plays a crucial role in this process, and what I have in mind here is that you associate a representation of a word with this abstracted representation or with a product concept. Okay. Now, the output of the abstraction process does exhibit this nomological covariance property, exactly because it represents the category as a whole, including things that have not been amongst the instances that I have perceived. And the reason why it does so is because all members of a wider category would bear enough similarities to the abstract or the product concept. Okay? And then we have endogenous control by language, and this is how I am suggesting that you can acquire a concept. And even if you buy the story so far, you might say that, okay, this is fine, but it's just for simple concepts. And the interesting stuff is what we do with other concepts. I mean, imagine heterogeneously instantiated concepts like, I don't know, danger. I mean, anything could be a dangerous thing or an instance of danger. I mean, high drops, open flames, a sharp knife. Imagine all these representations be fed into the abstraction process. What would be the overlapping similarity there? That's the problem that an empiricist should be looking at. Now, I think that despite this perceptual heterogeneity across these instances, there are some sameness markers. And I'm not using that in a necessarily Millikan's way, but just roughly that there's something that can flag these two perceptually diverse representations as similar or as closely related. And I'm looking at facial expressions at this stage, and I'm assuming that danger is a highly scaffolded process, or learning what danger is a highly scaffolded process by presence of the parent. Okay? So assume that there are different occasions where a child approaches, I don't know, a high drop or an open flame or a sharp knife, and so on and so forth. Very briefly, a mother would be scared about the well-being of the child, probably scream to attract attention, and have a scared facial expression, and so on and so forth. Now, if that's the story, then, and you assume that this abstraction process I've suggested is fine and sound, then you end up having the output which picks out facial expressions, emotional states of fear, perhaps, as well as some dangerous instances, which is not really what we wanted to do. So we would nomologically covariate with all these things. And the key point is that to go back to the semantics account I'm appealing to, and namely the condition B, where Jesse says that an actual instance of an instance of the given kind has to be the actual incipient cause. And even if you think that a facial expression was the actual cause of the concept danger, well, the actual thing is that a dangerous thing was the incipient cause for both my concept danger and facial expressions. So despite the proximal facial expression, proximal stimuli, there's a distal cause that causes all these representations. Now, in order for this story to get off the ground, you need to, I'm committed to the view that emotions are not cognitive, but I have to make this commitment, otherwise it's not going to happen. So I'm assuming that emotions are mechanisms that give out similar responses to apparent heterogeneity, and namely they produce representational homogeneity. And to this extent, I'm assuming that danger is rather a response-dependent property. Okay? Now, in order for this story to actually work, what you also need to have is a number of further dispositions. So you need to have stuff like the propensity of the bias, which is absolutely innate to look at faces. And I'm just using very brief, just a few references in the literature. De Simone and her colleagues show that we have a number of neurons which are dedicated to perception of faces. So to this extent, we're hardwired to do that. And again, these abilities are at the low level, so there's no need to appeal to any high-level concepts. And also, in order to acquire the concept of danger, you need to have something like the empathy of the beholder. So the child needs to understand that the emotional state in which the mother is, in order to understand that this thing is something to be feared of. And I'm thinking that emotions play a crucial role in the process of acquisition of danger. Now, at this point, I'm appealing to the work of Adolf and their colleagues, where they think that there's a strong relationship between somatosensation and emotional recognition. Namely, briefly, what they did was to study subjects with right hemisphere lesions, which couldn't process this somatosensory information properly or at all, and they had a hard time identifying or recognizing emotional states, while they didn't have any visual impairments. So this composite visual somatic system is necessary, as they claim, to attribute emotional states to others. And if you look to Ekman's famous affect program, a child can recognize an emotion simply by matching the facial expressions drawn by a mother and matching these representations with the emotional state that the child would have been in order to draw the similar facial expression. And it is how we recognize emotional expressions. And to this extent, the story that I've been giving you is kind of more made more concrete, but there is the final thing that needs to be present in order for this for the child to be able to pinpoint at the actual cause in the environment. And namely, to account for this, I'm appealing to Brooks and Eltov evidence showing that child from, if I'm not mistaken, from the 11th and 12th month, they're able to recognize that adults are visually connected to the world. So before that, children would, by 9 months, children would simply attend or follow or turn their heads as alongside the parent. But from the 11th month onward, they have to they sharply distinguish between open eyes and closed eyes conditions. So what they did was to have a child, an examiner in front of a child, and when the examiner, before the examiner turned their head, just close their eyes and then the older children wouldn't really turn their heads. So we have the ability to follow gazes, and if we, given that we do that, the child is able to identify the actual cause of the facial expression, the emotional state elicited into the child because of that, and therefore to find out which is the instance of a dangerous thing. Now, again, even if you buy the story so far for simple concepts and for concepts that are instantiated in really diverse perceptual ways, I'm really way ahead of my schedule, but that's just fine, have more time for questions. But the interesting problem would be, how about lofty concepts? How about concepts that do not paint out any tangible entities? And here I'm appealing to language, and namely, I think that the whole acquisition process starts by learning the concept, the word democracy. Okay? I don't know what the thing is. I've just picked out a representation of democracy, either from, I don't know, seen it in the text or had other people using it, but I have nothing more than this representation. And then the interesting thing is that on the basis of this representation of a word, I can become a parasite on other people's usage of the word in my linguistic community. And I can do that because I can track down instances of this word democracy. And the idea here is that as soon as I can track down instances of the word democracy, I can listen to other people talking about other stuff at the same time, like, I don't know, political system or representative system, or even, I don't know, acting of voting and casting a vote in a ballot and so on and so forth. But I'm assuming that in order to acquire democracy, you need to have other concepts prior to that. Now, these other concepts do not have to be innate. I guess we could come up with a similar story about how we ended up having these other concepts. But the idea is that once you track down instances of the word democracy and you find out instances of other concepts, you can pick out this inferential pattern, use in your linguistic community, and project this Hebbian rule to connections between concepts. And you're going to have stronger connections carrying or connecting, bringing together concepts that are really used while we use democracy. Even though this is not always the case, but in the light of a number of experiences, you can pick out this inferential pattern. So, on this, against this background, I'm arguing that essentially acquiring the concept of democracy is learning how to constrain the word democracy in the right kind of way. Of course, I haven't given you a story of how the concept of democracy appeared in the first time. So we're not talking about the genesis of democracy, but just a learning story about, given that this concept exists in our linguistic community, how is it that we could learn it? Okay? And this is pretty much what I had to say. And as a take-home message, I think that by appealing to these low-level mechanisms is enough to account for a full conceptual repertoire. And I've given you a story about learning via abstraction, which is I take to be a psychologically rich process, and therefore these things that are the output of abstraction do not have to be innate. And this is, I'll leave it there, and thank you for your attention.
We have plenty of time for questions, so this time you're allowed to make more than one question.
So the covariance theory of extension just seems to me to be obviously false.
Okay.
Look, I look at a forest full of trees. I don't think of each of them, that's a tree, that's a tree, that's a tree, that's a tree. It's not the case that each tree that I encounter elicits from me a tokening of the concept tree. Sure. I'm out in the desert. I think there aren't any trees around here. I've tokened the concept tree, but there are no trees in front of me. So in what sense can it be maintained that the extension of a concept is the set of things, the occurrence of which co-occurs with tokenings of the concept?
I'm not sure I'm getting the question. So, I'm giving you a story that you acquire.
What do you mean? Just tell me, what is this covariance? Covariance means when the thing that the concept applies to is present, you token the concept.
Yeah.
When you token the concept, the thing that the concept applies to is present. But this is just plainly false.
Well, it would have been if I didn't say that I also had. Well, for paraconcepts, they're not concepts, they're paraconcepts, okay? So they can only be activated in a bottom-up way, so in presence of the reference. Well, concepts can also be activated endogenously or in a top-down manner, okay? So I can do that with concepts, but this is not part of the learning story. This is what you do once you have acquired that. So the abstraction process just gives you the paraconcepts.
So you missed the whole step of telling me how I get the concept tree.
Okay, I've given you a story of how you acquire the paraconcept.
Yeah.
And then the trick, the one that you think I've skipped, or I haven't probably spent too much time on, is that language plays a crucial role in that. And the idea is that we do have executive control over our utterances of words,
Okay.
and just by associating the two, the formula bestows this executive control.
Okay, so what you said about democracy already goes for tree.
What I've said
What you
already.
said about the word democracy
Yeah,
already goes for the word tree,
Yeah.
for the concept tree.
yeah. Well, it's not different kinds of acquisition stories for different kinds of concepts. It's just that different aspects of it to deal with.
One more then, since you're giving us permission. What's the difference between looking at an oak tree and abstracting the concept oak tree, and looking at an oak tree and abstracting the concept tree?
Well, it could be different. Well, selective attention, it might be part of your agenda, your goals, specific salient features that drive your attention to different aspects of the tree. So I don't care whether it's an oak tree if I don't know that it's a tree. But later on, I have a lot of. So this is I've given you a toy model in order to account for what we do in real life. But I think that we don't ignore previous experiences. It's rather a dynamic process. A process that builds upon previous experience anyway. So I need to know tree in order to acquire oak tree.
But so what's the difference between the concept oak tree and the concept tree?
Well, the tree picks out all trees.
Well, how does it pick that out?
Will be tokens every time, will be activated whenever we see any kind of tree. Well, oak tree will always be activated nomologically covariant only with oak trees. Right? You don't.
It's okay. Okay, that's an answer.
Maybe there's a second one. Eric.
So this is a bit of a suggestion and maybe a redescription of what you're doing. So I'm glad you like this idea that Steve and I have, that you have to at least have a theory of content in mind to constrain how you're theorizing about how this stuff is acquired. I take your point that you're not deeply committed to the Prince theory of content, or just kind of illustrating. So in that way, I think you're running the story that's parallel to what we're doing, and maybe a little bit parallel to what Dan and Weisskopf is doing. So go to your democracy case. I think you're misdescribing what's really happening there. And that what you really want is just some generic conceptual role semantics, and that language is just servicing, helping establishing the conceptual roles. If you're using something like the Prince account, where you're combining this nomological covariance with the actual causal history of the early days, the incipient cause, I think you end up with just acquiring the wrong concept. And the way you described it, you illicitly recruited other materials. So the incipient cause for democracy is probably the word democracy. It's not democracy. And later on, there's going to be a nomological relation between hearing democracy spoken and having democracy thoughts, even though other things are going to be causing democracy thoughts. So what makes this about these reliable causes of democracy thoughts as opposed to those reliable causes? It's the thing that was the first cause. The thing that was the first cause, in many cases, will be the word, in which case what you've now acquired is the concept of the word democracy, not democracy.
I agree with that.
Well, okay, so now, how do you acquire the concept democracy? Just chuck all that. You don't need any of that machinery. The way it sounded to me that you acquired the concept democracy is you said, well, you have other representations, and now that you have the word, it helps you kind of organize those into inferences that are appropriate to democracy. That's just a conceptual semantics. And that's kind of a standard model. I mean, if someone was only asking the question, is it possible for a concept not to be innate, and wasn't asking, what is the true detailed model of how you acquire a concept? A standard answer is, well, the way you learn a concept is you take the other concepts that you have and you kind of put them together in a new way, and now you have a new concept. It sounds to me that
No,
that's really
that's
what
fine.
you're doing.
The things that I don't think that there necessarily has to be a problem with nomological covariance because the incipient, Prince's account anyway, because the incipient causes are different. What I have in mind is the initial incipient causes a word out of context, like I don't know, I've seen a word and that's the incipient cause of my word, the concept of the word. So there are two concepts here: the concept of the word and the concept of the thing, or the, I don't know, the state that is a democracy. Okay, and the reason the incipient cause of that is the inferential pattern in my linguistic community. That is the incipient cause for my concept of democracy that picks out political systems.
That part seems to me like a big fudge.
Okay.
Like, I mean, I don't know how to decide what the incipient cause is, but if I'm actually just looking at a kid and they have some kind of concept sort of that gets filled out over time because they hear people talking about democracy, to me it sounds like the incipient cause of the concept democracy is the linguistic event.
Right. But would you say that this kid would have acquired the same concept if you just heard, I don't know, her dad saying democracy? No, that's it. Just like democracy.
Well, this whole thing is very artificial because there's no such thing as the incipient cause. I mean, there's like multiple related, sort of things. But you could be, intuitively, it's just talking about democracy. That's the thing that's activating thoughts about democracy. It's just a lot of talk.
Yeah.
Right? So it's
But
language.
Language, but that picks out, that allows us to use this inferential pattern.
Right, but the inferential pattern doesn't strike me as being usefully labeled as an incipient cause. It's just an inferential pattern. That's why I think that what's really going on is you have all this kind of machinery, but really you're just adopting conceptual semantics and saying the way you acquire lofty concept is because you have the kind of mind that allows you to reassemble your prior representations into interesting new ways. In this case, the interesting new way is one that does justice to a linguistic practice.
I agree with you that conceptual semantics could do that job for you, but I don't think that the other story should have worked either. So, but do you think that the whole incipient cause via the inferential pattern is attached?
I guess when you point to that and say that's the incipient cause, I just don't know whether you're right or not, but it just seems to me, if I didn't have any theoretical baggage and I was trying to say that's the incipient cause, then I wouldn't say that it was democracy that was the incipient cause for anything.
Right.
Democracy doesn't cause utterances of democracy. Right. Lots of things cause talk about democracy. Sometimes it's the absence of democracy that's causing democracy.
Yeah. But I'm just, I quite like this idea of just that, just in his fantasy mind, just has that in a sentence, saying that lofty concepts are slaves to a linguistic network.
Well, see,
So this is all the reason.
lots of people think that. They just don't have any of his other badges. And this is hardly like a Prince idea.
No.
Lots of people have the idea that, to put it very neutrally, that language is kind of a catalyst for creating conceptual roles. That's a kind of meme that's around.
So then you would go for having this kind of semantics for the whole repertoire of
Well,
concepts.
for just a lot of abstract concepts, but particularly the kind that I think you're thinking is lofty concepts.
Right. Okay.
At the beginning of your talk, you have said that similarity between different stimulus can be determined by the activation of the same or similar sets of neurons.
Yeah.
But my point is, in base of which features of dimensions does this activation takes place? Because when the stimulus of the different trees are distinct, how that activation takes place, and if they depend on features, how this not leads again to the problem of circularity in our acquisition of context. Well, because ultimately these features are assumed as input of the acquisition process. I don't know.
Okay, so I'm just assuming again a light-bodied reduction, so to speak. So if you have you simply then tree, and you have assume that it's just a visual experience, and you have selective attention focusing on, or you selectively attend on the trunk and the branches. I'm assuming that the saccades will be moved to a specific part of the visual field, okay? And you will see a vertical thing, and then a thing standing vertically to the ground, and so on and so forth. So regardless of the particularities of different instances of trees, there would be some overlapping similarity that all trees would have this thing sticking out of the ground, and then on top they have branches. Okay, so it is on the basis of properties and features.
Yes. Yes.
So then the circularity word was about concepts.
Yes.
So how do you know that all these instances are instances of tree, right?
But this topological structure, a vertical one for the another one for the branches, are ultimately features. You know, a given structure with a given shape, another geometrical structure. So, well, how these structures are recognized?
Okay, so they're not really. So just pick out this information, and the next time around you just think that this representation or this bit of information is similar to the other one. You don't know. You don't have to identify something as meaningful in order to perceive it, I think. So you can do that. I mean, these mechanisms are really low level. They don't use any conceptual resources. You don't rationalize about these things. You just, well, at least with this scenario that I'm giving you, you just pick out this information, you form this representation, and you store it, and just similar to the previous one. So I'm assuming that you don't know what it is, right?
Yes. Well, that my point was ultimately that if you are able to recognize these structures, you are also able to recognize what a tree is. So, doesn't this means that you are assuming what you try to explain? You are assuming the recognition of the features that you are trying to explain when you join them together to constitute the tree concept.
Well, I don't think that I do, because you just based on these top-down effects from stored experiences and co-representation. You don't. What I'm trying to explain is concepts, and I don't think I'm giving concepts in order to cluster these things together. But maybe we can discuss that later. Yeah.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask about your kind of intermediate level concepts here, dangerous.
Yeah.
And I don't know, maybe I got this wrong, but it seemed like you were saying that you got to acquire those kinds of concepts because they were associated with a particularly distinctive kind of behavioural profile. So yeah. So that seems problematic to me. I mean, so I might respond to things that are dangerous when my child approaches dangerous things in a certain kind of way. But I also respond to, there are finer grained concepts that might have exactly the same recognition. So things that are vicious might stimulate the same kind of visual response with me. But also, diametrically opposed concepts or properties might instigate the same kind of response. So, my child crawling towards a knife makes me scream. My child crawling towards my mini vase makes me scream, So how are they supposed to be getting delicate versus dangerous? All that going on is my visual.
Okay. I don't think that. Okay, this is again a very simple case that I've given you, but I do believe that. Would you think that it's intuitive that later on then you would take the mean place and hide away, or that you would tell your child that you shouldn't break this thing, and so on and so forth? Do you think that a genuine? I'm pretty sure that. Well, I guess what I have in mind is that there will be different behavioural patterns when the child really approaches a dangerous thing rather than something that you don't want to break.
Okay, so I think that's an empirical question.
Yeah.
There really is this distinction.
But the
My
whole
gut
idea.
feeling is about it. Exactly.
And just a simple thing, like kids knowing that plants are dangerous. You're not told not to go near the plant.
Okay.
Showing hesitancy towards a plant as opposed to a
Very
non-natural object.
speak louder.
Oh, well, the question was whether there's any empirical evidence on things that where either the reaction is the same or you don't have a reaction, and there is evidence, particularly for danger. I don't, but danger's not, it's not like you care about that example, you're just using it because it's heterogeneous. But that is an example where there's good evidence that kids know that certain foods should be thought of as dangerous, even if they're not getting any social cues.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So, but the idea again, I mean, if you forget about danger, the idea is that these widely instantiated concepts, you need to have a sandwich market in order to be deployed in this abstraction process. And we hopefully I've shown you that this is possible anyway.
But I guess my worry is that really your intermediate concepts are going to collapse into your lofty concepts. That really, when you start thinking about all these things that might be, if this was the right way to go, if you're thinking about the things that might inform me about whether I should be thinking about this as dangerous versus delicate, then you're going to start with the language.
But you need to have something, at least, okay, I would be perfectly happy with having just lofty and simple concepts, because you need to have some concepts pretty musically, and you need to have this more simple scenario that I gave you in the beginning, but I would be more than happy to have the lofty story concepts for all kinds of concepts. But you need to deal with concepts in non-linguistic channels, I guess, and pretty early developmental stages. That's why, and then I try to take it step by step. And I guess it's a clear-cut case of the problem when empiricists have this widely instantiated concept. That's why they use it. But it's just that we do have low-level mechanisms that would allow us to bind these anticipations together. And maybe the example is not the most brilliant, but we're just trying to put in the table details of how this could happen. But yeah, we'd be pretty happy to have a lofty kind of story for all concepts. I'm pretty sure that later in life, when we have language, this is how we do that.
Yeah, except, just very another thing, except you might think that you were telling a more compelling story because you were showing how there was a development of, moves through these things. You didn't have to go straight from simply to lofty. But if it turns out that your intermediate cases really are indistinguishable from the other cases, then maybe the overall story.
Well, developmentally maybe that applies, but I think that you could also do that via language. And I don't think that you could have a distinct developmental stage where you're using the danger story and the child does not have any language that could aid towards this process. So maybe you do a combination thing, maybe there is a developmental stage, I have no idea, but yeah.
Just more curiosity, because this kind of theories all then have traditional questions that need to be addressed, and I don't see exactly how it will. So let me just start from one question is more, give me the direction. So one of the things that people know is that there is a lot of invariance of different experiences that finally coagulate to the same concept. And there is also a lot of lack of data very often that still get people having pretty rich concepts. Okay? So let me give you a very clear example of the first case, which is what I wanted to ask you more. It is known that blind people have very rich concepts of vision, right? And in fact, you can even show that in certain kind of cases they actually the same area that we do. Now, thinking about your proto-concept, what is your prediction? That there will be any convergence? So that only when you start learning language, somebody would converge on the same concept if he or she is blind, if he or she is deaf, he or she. So, because the story you're giving is extremely dependent on very basic metrics that you do over the extraction of these very low-level regularities, right? So how do you account for this very simple problem that it doesn't seem that they have a different set of concepts than a blind person? And in general, how do you account for the fact that you mentioned that they have a different concepts from here about things of which we have had incredibly widely different experiences?
Sure. Okay. So I have been using visual experiences as my base, but I'm pretty sure that you could also do that with tactile representations and so on and so forth. It's just that this perceptual representation will be still fed into.
But you cannot have tactile representation of color concepts, and the blind people understand color.
But I don't know how they would do that, but I guess language would contribute for the lack of visual information.
So what the answer is there is a wide variability of proto-concepts, and it's only when you get language that this variability gets somewhat averaged by some kind of process.
I don't think so, because, well, essentially you just The proto-concept is the output of processing representations, okay, that I have and that you have.
Well,
so
I
the
don't have
proto-concept,
because we have eyes, but if I don't have eyes, what are the kind of representation that are output from this low-level concept
So we
have to
have-
be in different language, like
Yeah.
hard as opposed to green.
yeah, it would be different. The proto-concept would be different. Of
So
course,
everybody would have different proto-concepts.
to a certain extent. But assume that we living blind people out of the picture for the moment. Now, me and I are having different experiences with trees, okay? I come from a part of the world that trees are, I don't know, whatever, and you come from a different. But they do share some properties, okay? Now, I didn't say much about this, but there is a. I didn't say anything really about that. But that's the key here, that the proto-concept plays the role of a representational core when you individuate concepts. I have this story about how concepts become individuated, and it's a combination of things that Jess is saying and stuff like proto-concept. So when you individuate a concept, you have this representational core, which is the proto-concept, okay? And on top of that, you have a representation of a particular that is activated in virtue of context, agendas, and so on and so forth. So the representational core is what allows for shareability. Even though we do have different experiences with trees, we all know we have some similarities, that there is a trunk and some things on top.
But that's because we have the concept.
This is how we have the concept.
No, that's because we have the concept.
Well, if this is an empirical story and you have this input of particular representations,
Which is very different from people to people or from
Yeah.
line to non-line, yes.
but
So clearly the metric must be different, the kind of similarity to metric must be different.
I'm not trying to. Sorry, go on.
No, sorry, go ahead.
I'm not trying to say that there's a definition of, I don't know, necessary and sufficient conditions for concepts, but I'm assuming that there are some overlapping similarities across the instance of trees that you have experienced and that I have experienced, enough to communicate. Most often we have, if there's a network of representations like that big, okay, and we communicate, there's a small overlap between our set of representations comprising your concept of, a lecture and mine, but we have enough representations to communicate. And that's a good thing. I think that's a positive characteristic of this view, because communication does break down, especially if you take it out of context. If you have totally different agenda and goals than I do, and you're in completely different context, then I might be not understanding what you're saying. And with this way, you can understand this communicational breakdown. Otherwise, they will always be successful if we have the exact same representations and the exact same concepts.
Let me give you another one which has to do with dangerous things. You can show that infants and children have the concept of dangers for things that they've never experienced ever. And in fact, these things are far from their environment or everything. Would you say that this comes only when they acquire language, or because I don't see how in your story this, as it were, stability, which seems to this is triggered perceptually, not conceptual. So I show you a car and you consider it to be less dangerous than a wild lion, although you have never experienced a wild lion in your life, and you have experienced many, many cars.
Right. I don't know. I imagine that the first time I acquire danger or see an incident of a dangerous thing, and I see my parent screaming or whatever, I have no idea what that thing is, okay? Next time around, when I see something new, maybe I'm more careful. So I'm just looking for the scaffold, looking for the mother. I mean, it's quite common to see children looking at mother's faces, right?
But it doesn't look like the story of acquisition of this concept. That's my worry. If you look at the literature, that doesn't look like a plausible story.
Okay.
It could be a good theoretical reconstruction, but I think that there is some more digging into the data that might be needed to refine whether you think that this is an actual plausible. So it looks like what you're doing is like Hegel's phenomenology of concept. It's just some sort of yes, a story that is a plausible story of what do I think things could possibly go in an ideal world, but in fact, if you look at the data, that doesn't look like. So you see lots of kids who see parents who are very scared about cars, but there is no perceptual filtering down into your proto concept. Kids are scared by lions that they have never seen in their life, but not by cars. which are actually the proximal cause of death, not lines. There are not so many lines.
Even earlier, stranger danger.
Yeah,
Where the parents are encouraging you to be friendly with this man, and the kid is just, none of it.
So there is a lot more suggestion that whatever the proximal cause to the generation of a concept is expanded to something that is way beyond what it is, independently of the language scaffolding. That is the only thing.
In the case of danger, didn't really appeal to language, even though...
No, I know. The case of danger is a case in which you show that there is a lot more structure that comes directly from what we would be proper concept that doesn't seem to depend on experience.
How about you form the concept in the way I say, and then you just enrich this representational database with different instances?
The point is that we don't. So, for example, infants and children in our society are not scared by cars, which are the most proximal case of death, right? And they're scared by lions, which they never perceive. And they've never seen a mother being scared when they see a lion, because there are not so many lions around. They've seen the mother scared when the cars approaches. They don't seem to, perceptually, they don't seem to, to pick up cars as dangerous.
Would you be thinking that I'm naive to think
this? Because Mides and Subido.
Yeah, I think that's...
Oh, yeah, okay, good.
So, is it...
That's right,
do you think that I'm naive to think that, well, children also see cars being stationary or even riding cars every day to school, and they have also some more negative experiences or positive experiences with cars. While their only difference to lions is a picture and mother saying that, well, this is a man-eating creature.
I think that that's not what happened really. What is happening is something much closer to the fact there is much more structure to the concept of space, which is probably evolutionaries being selected, because evolution is not so fast as our society, there is a discorrelation, and that's fine. The point is that this could be a problem for the story, because you don't have a way to account for that. You have predictions that don't seem to be borne by the data at the level of the concept, and the level of concept is another story. But, so the blank case I gave you could be a possibility, and this case I think is another possibility.
What if you have this abstraction process taking time, I don't know, periodically, just making that, but in order to enrich this pro concept, and you still think that this is not how it happens, but how do you really isolate the initial experience that I had to acquire concept by everyday experiences with, which are car friendly, and I'm using my car to...
Actually, very often you don't. That is the problem. So, for example, people who are scared, this is another case, people who are scared about snakes or...
The best one is things like snake bites.
Yes.
So the number of deaths for snake bite in the United States, or even worse, spider bites, it's less than 1.
Yeah.
But the number of people who die from falling every year is like 40,000. And people's phobias are organized around spiders and about falling.
So would you say that the parents' reaction would be the same when you see a big spider with hairy legs or whatever, or just going for a walk?
I don't think it's plausible, but you could
say the reaction. Do you think that a mother would be more scared to see a spider near her child than to, I don't know, see close to something people fall?
When you look at all the kinds of cases and where people live and how many opportunities they actually even have to encounter these types of animals, I just don't think it's plausible. And also how universal this pattern is, as like we were saying, the variability of experience is really extraordinary.
So the point is here is, if you want to hold this story, you really need to go down and actually check into actual data about some of the concepts you want to hold. And the second point is that maybe you want to, how much are these objections and objections which are really knockdown objections to your story? I'm not sure they're knockdown in this case. Maybe you want to refine it, but you need to sort of somewhat restrict the generality of your story. And it may be possible that your story is a story about, say, for example, artifact concepts. Also there is a lot of issues about the fact that there is a knowledge about artifact which is much richer than. But what I'm saying is that you have to at least minimally add, my feeling, a very rich evolutionary story about a rather big class of concepts that doesn't require the kind of abstraction or proto-conceptual input that you are suggesting here to be general. That's the feeling. My feeling.
Yeah, I think we can take a 5-minute break and then start with this.